I'm going to get through the really boring stuff quickly, just to kind of set the scene. Demographic analysis is a large part of what we do in my company, Cornerstone Strategies. We're cultural regeneration, but we're part of a much bigger group called the Chambers, which is a retail and leisure management network. However, what we really prefer to do is become incredibly narrow in our research, narrow and deep, and just choose characters with whom we're going to work, rather than saying we're going for A, B, C, fours, 40 to 50, et cetera, et cetera. We have eschewed all of that years ago, and we just go for stories, much like Megan. And we go for mapping, much like Julian. So what we do when we're trying to find things out is transactional analysis, because what we're interested in is why people do things in spaces. Because we're hired usually to make and to build, quite often what we end up saying to our clients is don't build anything and don't make anything. People are already doing it here. So in the end, what we're paid to be is nosy. So this is the way we look at it. Spatial psychology for us is built on the expert usership of the people who actually use those spaces, not on the demographic analysis or the CACI stats. It's based on who is actually in there. And it's understanding what people are actually doing in these spaces. These spaces could be within films, they can be in underpasses, they can be in sheds, they could be in shops. It's about the notion of space and the notion of what a transaction is. So what we do is as like good little researchers, we always examine the demographic data first. We try to understand what the issues arising out of that data might be. And then we find the first connector, the first person, the first spider in the web, the first journalist, the first little old lady who's stuck indoors, that's looking out the window, first guy at the pub who's been there for the last 25 years watching people come and go. Incredibly labor intensively, we try to find people who are going to work with us to find a whole cascade of people who will act as characters in the films we make to reassure ourselves we're understanding what's going on somewhere. And we call it finding the voice. What we're trying to do is go inside a space and find out the voices within that space, listen to those voices and decide what it is that actually needs to be done. So I'm going to take you through a few projects we've done and show you how things have evolved and, in effect, how we come to be here today. Quite classically, we get hired all the time by people with trillions and trillions of dollars to find out how they're going to sell more luxury goods to people who don't really want them. And this is a classic project in Dubai. Again, a classic trillionaire, an Asian fashion retailer who was absolutely convinced that what the UAE needed was more fashion brands and possibly a Harrods. So we looked at all the possible data we could get, and within about a week we were quite able to tell him that the people he hoped to sell these brands to actually didn't exist in the way he thought. There were very few Western expatriates who had the money to buy these luxury goods anymore. This is just before the crash, by the way, 2008. And in fact, the majority of visitors to the UAE were either people coming to buy vast numbers of nappies for large extended families in the rest of the Gulf, or they were people on working holidays and sex tourism, I'm sorry to say, from other parts of the Gulf, or they were people who were already owned everything that this guy planned to sell them. He wanted it justified, so he looked at the opportunity and the frequency of visits. And what was clear was, again, his target grouping, the quote-unquote Western tourists, most of whom were Japanese, were going to come actually relatively infrequently and spend virtually nothing because they didn't want what it was he was going to sell them. And the people who came the most often, again, who had the money, who might be interested, had already bought it back home, and in fact were his cousins from India. So we then looked at various shopping modes, tried to rationalize again for him what are the mindsets that people have when they're shopping in the UAE. And again, the people who were most likely to buy or have the kind of money that would be able to afford what he was going to sell them were the existing Emirati families who had already bought everything in Italy on their skiing vacations. So when grading the risk factors, it was again pretty clear to him that if he was going to do a standalone Harrods, it was going to be a massive, massive risk, and his lowest risk was basically to set up a market stall. He also didn't really understand who these expert shoppers were going to be. What luxury meant for him was something extremely old-fashioned. It was Harrods. What luxury meant for the only target grouping who would be interested in what he was doing, which is wealthy young Asians, who already in many cases owned the goods, was something more like Harvey Nichols. And here's the difficult thing. Harvey Nichols already exists in the UAE, and it was failing. So when we then, our last-ditch attempt to convince him that no one wanted Harrods in the UAE was to visualize for him convincingly the kind of people and the kind of experiences that were going to happen in that shop. And of course, it didn't look like anything he thought. So he gave up. We told him to sell luxury foods in India and to stop pestering the UAE. Also classic, we get asked by iconic leisure retailers quite often to understand how they're going to actually sell products based on their films. And the classic one, we worked for 2 years with the people who made the James Bond films, Eon Productions, who were trying to work out how to flog more Rolexes, basically. And in the research they'd done, they had all these incredibly boring focus groups in New York where people sat around for a month at a time trying to examine what Bondness meant. And we, by contrast, said, let's go back to London, let's go to the headquarters, get a whole lot of props out on the table, and hire every weirdo who ever went to a Bond film, the people who dress up as Bond all the time, the people in lingerie, et cetera, get them together and just brainstorm the whole thing. And what became clear was the space for people, mental space for people who want to own a Bond-type piece of product is the film. It's only fantasy. They don't want anything that's practical. So what it really came down to was people wanted gadgets which did completely stupid things, and girls. They wanted the girls. And if they couldn't have the girls, they were going to have the lingerie and the swimwear. So we came up with outrageous lingerie swimwear with a Jean Provocateur and some extraordinarily dumb, extremely expensive gadgets, and sold these to people who had more money than sense, but they were thrilled because it was all just fantasy stuff. It wasn't real life. We do a lot of work for Topshop. New Look is my favorite client. They sell a bag full of happiness to someone who has £5. What can be better than that? But in working with them to take their small stores to flagship stores, they were convinced it was all about buildings, and it was all about aisles, and it was all about shopping circulation. And we said to them, no, the only important space for a shopper at New Look is what is going on inside that woman's head. Inside that woman's head is chatter. And the chatter is about, look at that. I can have 4 of those. I can go out of here with a complete outfit, and I've only spent £10. I'm here with my best friends. So we said the most important thing was about getting a conglomeration of, in effect, product together to make it look so bursting at the seams that someone would go out of there feeling satisfied. So the space there was head space, not physical space. Years of working for Sainsbury on a project, which in the end we were very happy to kill off, was coming up with aisle television. We had 15 channels all going at the same time. It was digital broadcasting, and it was really Sainsbury trying to react to the fact that Tesco had digital broadcasting. What's interesting here, though, is that, again, they thought it was all about kit, building stuff, investing in stuff. And we said that when people go shopping, they're going down an aisle, absolutely, but they're going down at a walking pace because they're trying not to miss anything. So if you're broadcasting to them, it's got to be at heartbeat pace. It's got to be at the slow walking pace you have when you're trying to appraise product on either side. It's got to be at places where your eye actually falls. And in effect, the entire thing is by peripheral vision. So the content we came up with for Sainsbury's was all dreamscapes. It had nothing to do with promoting anything. It was just getting people in the mood to accept the fact that they were going to buy a banana. This went on for a couple of years, and it was a very big investment on their part. It was a lot of fun on our part, but this is the reality of why people hire us. Now to get to cities, which is probably even more interesting. When we work in cities, this whole question of expert usership becomes even more important because it isn't just a question of building buildings. It's often a question of reorienting a complete cityscape. And a classic example here is Watford. We were hired to do the Watford cultural strategy last year. And the big question here on the part of our clients, of the local authority, was how much of Watford should they tear down? You know, how should they reorient the motorways? What were all these poor people going to do? Now they realized they had to have culture. So we went out, we did the usual thing. We found 13 people with whom to work. And then we asked our clients, where were all the cultural venues in the city that they were going to cram into this cultural quarter? And they gave us a list of 10. We went out and we followed all of our archetypes. We spent time with them and discovered that they had no interest in any of the cultural venues that the city had in mind. What they all liked to do was go to the park and go to the pub. And the park was the major cultural venue. It was also clear that the various people they hoped to serve were not the people who were actually interested in being served. And most of the people who were actually missing out were actually very young. What you find in Watford is excellent local music scene and an awful lot of booze. And if you weren't into either of those things, there was nothing for you. So we looked at each one of their cultural assets, we looked at the investment needed, came back to the park. And then, again, this is very similar to what both Megan and Julian have been talking about. We looked at the whole constrictive element of the motorway at Watford and the problems that our clients thought it had. The cultural quarter, as far as they were concerned, was cut in two. But when we started hanging out around here, we spent an awful lot of time in the underpasses because that's where people were actually gathering. And people were finding their way around the city, underneath motorways, not worrying about car parks, completely ignoring what the city had in mind because they were following bike paths. And each one of the places that people actually wanted to go to was absolutely accessible by people who wanted to find it. But the council was convinced they weren't able to find all these things. So the council had managed to neglect probably 2/3 of the cultural venues in Watford which were already in use. You know, it's going to be one of those awful builds. Ignore it, it's going to be over soon. I think the thing for us was, oh my God, this is terrible. Anyway, this is the interesting slide. Instead of a cultural quarter, it was a cultural cockroach and a scarab. And what's wonderful here is the cultural quarter, it's based, well, it's, you know, your classic hub and spoke, but it was a real hub and spoke. And people genuinely were finding their ways through underpaths and along bike paths. And so when our work was taken to inform the master planners were sore dismayed when they saw that there was not much building going to be going on and not much detailed design. But actually local cultural groups we worked with were actually quite pleased to see that they'd been listened to for once. So often, the solution is meant to be building yet another building. In this case, it was going to be the biggest F-off design exchange in the world, IDX. Millions of pounds were spent about 3 years ago on investigating international design exchange for designers in London, forget the provinces, and designers were going to hang out there and meet clients in a skyscraper. And you know, Foster's was hired, everyone was hired to do all the feasibility, but there was something terribly wrong. No designers were interested in going because they were all busy trying to make a living. So our company was hired basically to kill the project off, but they had to have a decent way out. It had been going on for a couple of years. So we went around and found all the designers who refused to go to the building and asked them what they wanted to do. They said they'd rather have the money. And in fact, where they really hung out was in these sheds. You see this lovely black and white photo, and what they're really making was beautiful furniture without any intervention by the state whatsoever. So it was killed off. Likewise, in Blackpool, we were asked a couple of years ago to go and post-rationalize a big lottery submission, not for the casino, I might say, based on sustainable lighting and actually quite an innovative approach to how you were going to make the illuminations into something which would be a world-class destination. But the assumption on the part of our clients was that no one there would understand it, and the older folk would really prefer to see the illuminations. They couldn't have been more wrong. We were given 2 weeks to find out what people actually wanted, and to our delighted surprise, it was the older people who we interviewed through a whole series of instant vox pops, sort of a cascade of vox pops, who were completely on board for it and said what they worried about was that people thought that Blackpool illuminations was something which would go on forever. They were much more concerned about what their kids were up to and what the prospects were for their kids. Kids, Space, Generations project in Bognor Regis, which just finished this year. We were asked by Sony and Building Schools for the Future to go in and understand how people of several generations communicate on one very deprived estate with a community college where people from the ages of like 0 to 80 had all gone to the same school. And to develop a digital, again, the dreaded digital broadcast system, in this case to be run by students, so it was going to be student TV. How would kids communicate? How would their parents communicate? And of course, the communication in the end was about people and being around people. It didn't matter whether they were communicating on Twitter, on phone, through television, whatever. It didn't matter whether different generations were communicating in using different media. The issue was tribalism. They didn't want to move away. They wanted to be there around that campus. That was where they all were from. They didn't want to move to London. What they wanted was something which was going to keep them there on site. This is a project I'm going to show you a little film on in a minute, but very dear to my heart. The Durham Necklace Park. We spent 4 years up in Durham as the visioning consultants when they got a great deal of millennium money to find out where they were going, as opposed to where they already were. And 12 projects in, we were happy to inform our clients that local people did not want more buildings, surprise, surprise. What they wanted was access to what was already there. Durham is surrounded by, it's in fact a hole in a donut, surrounded by 12 mining villages with extreme poverty in many of them, and with one bus going in a day, one bus coming back out at night from the city centre. And working with the Voices of Durham, the issue became, how do we access our countryside again? How do we access all the land that is cut off? Why is everything here something where we can no longer go? What happened to our legacy? Out of that came an ephemeral park agreement for people who owned land and who wanted to access land to exist, to exemplify certain behaviors of how you share land so that they could access each other's land. It became a massive project worldwide with 15,000 mappers online and on foot, mapping experiences that they might want to have in this necklace park, which includes all of the city centre, I might say, the cathedral, the castle, etc. I'll show you a little film in a minute, because it always makes my heart glad to see what people really do in real life when they're trying to understand their own space. Gallipoli, the killing fields of Gallipoli, the scenes of the Trojan War. We, a number of years ago, were part of teams who went out there to understand what needed to be built there to deal with all of the soil erosion, to deal with all of the tourists. And in spending a month out there mapping, photographing at night, because there's so many bones, there's 750,000 dead bodies in Gallipoli with the bones sticking up out of the ground, which you see at night, phosphorescent. We did all of our work at night, working with local farmers, working with local pilgrims, and they didn't, again, need any buildings. What they wanted was places to pray, access to better farming conditions, places to fish, and places to remember. This is a project in Zimbabwe, which we've been working on for about 10 years, and it's, in effect, a bootleg charity. We work out anything which no one ever wants to use again ends up in Bulawayo, where they have absolutely nothing. What's interesting there is the people in Bulawayo, of whom are mostly now women and small children, almost all of the men of working age have died or have moved away. When it came down to it, they realized again they didn't want buildings either. What they wanted was uniforms. They wanted uniforms to show that they were up and running again. The kids had uniforms, the ladies and the cooperatives had uniforms. They wanted to show pride in the fact that they were building up new industries again and getting their country, in effect, back on track. So this is Temple Works, just down the road from you. Stuart informs me it's down there because I have no sense of direction. The great thing about this building is it's already there. We didn't have to build anything. What's happening there is things are being made. So our slogan is Made at Temple Works. It's a place to make experiences. It's a hard hat place. It's a place where you can go in and do what it is you think you'd like to do, because it's the most extraordinary series of spaces. And the voices that are being heard in there, in effect, are the voices of the people in this room. So this is what's happening at Temple Works. Come and have a look. Steve, we're going to show my film, and this is about a bunch of kids in Durham free running and mapping the Necklace Park. It's made by kids, for kids, about kids. The soundtrack is of a story they made up about angels on a very rough housing estate right nearby. But this is the Necklace Park. It's quite a manky old shopping center in the middle of it. But when you see what they did with it, it makes you glad that we've listened to them.